And I guess I know why. But the real topic today, and we're going to have a fascinating conversation on the resilience dialogue. In the last few months, unfortunately, we've seen natural disasters with an intensity and a frequency that we have not seen in a long time. But we have been talking about this issue for many years. With climate change, the frequency and intensity of natural disasters is going to increase. And therefore, we need to get ready not only for the disasters of today, but those of tomorrow. And maybe this is the opening of an understanding of a glimpse on the new window of how things are going to be in the future. Today is the International Day for Disaster Reduction. Therefore, it's the most opportune day to have this resilience dialogue and with this distinguished group and to really figure out in practical ways and have a conversation on how we better protect vulnerable countries and communities from these extreme events. And we will talk a lot about infrastructure today, but it is also not only infrastructure, it is the natural environment, it is the communities, it is the households, the individuals. Resilience is a multidimensional issue altogether. Over the next 20 years, we're going to be building all these countries more infrastructure than in the last 2,000 years. And the way that this infrastructure is built will determine whether it is more resilient or not for generations to come. And therefore, the way in which this infrastructure is built, where is it located, the way that it relates with the surrounding environment, with communities, is fundamental. The decisions that local mayors, individuals, the construction industry, the national governments are going to be making in these 2 decades will have a tremendous blocking effect. So the infrastructure deficit is rising. You look at the numbers and it's always mind-boggling. You never know how many zeros do they have. They say $5 trillion a year into this process. And therefore the resilience component, the rethinking of how to build this infrastructure is what we want to have today. This is the 13th instance of the Resilience Dialogue series. We had a dozen successful events all over the world, keeping the conversation, keeping and deepening the conversation. And unfortunately, we get a lot more attention right after disasters, and sometimes it goes down. Last year was a year of less disasters, and therefore, I don't think that we filled the room, and this year is very much filled. So we had actually a meeting yesterday with governments from the Caribbean discussing progress on the Caribbean Resilience Insurance Facility, and you would have seen it was a standing room only, and we had Prime Minister sitting there and saying, how do we get together for that? So thank you for coming. Thank you to the partners of the Resilience Dialogue, the government of Japan, GFDRR, the European Union, USAID. Thank you to the climate group at the World Bank. John Room, our Senior Director for Climate, must be in the room. Thank you to him and his team for organizing this process. And I want to invite all of you to send your questions as we have the dialogue to the hashtag Resilience Dialogue. We're not going to have open mics. I'm going to have my phone open. So send the questions, because then I'm going to start grouping and bringing into the conversation. Hashtag Resilience Dialogue altogether. So with that, let me invite Koichi Hasegawa, the Senior Vice President for the Japan International Cooperation JICA agency, to welcome us and to say a few words here on stage. Hasegawa-san.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are here to discuss the role of how quality infrastructure improves resilience against climate and disaster risks. The timing could not be more relevant. Even within these past few months, the world has witnessed enormously destructive natural disasters, including various hurricanes and earthquakes. Given this, I would like to express my deepest condolences to the countries and people who are affected by those disasters. As you are all aware, disasters are growing in magnitude. The previous World Bank report warns that without significant investment to make cities more resilient, the costs of natural disasters in cities worldwide will increase from $250 billion today to $314 billion in 2030. This means that an additional 77 million urban residents may be pushed into poverty because of the impacts of climate change. Thankfully, efforts to combat this are already in progress. Momentum to fight these global issues have grown in the past decade, including through the establishment of SDGs and Paris Agreement, and also the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. Today, I would like to encourage us to make the best use of this momentum to improve disaster resilience by discussing two main points about resilient infrastructure. First, what does it mean to have quality infrastructure? And second, how do we build resilience? The importance of this term, quality infrastructure, was highlighted both when the G7 leaders met at the Ise-Shima summit in May last year and during the UN Habitat 3 last October. While this term is getting popular, it is important to understand what exactly we are talking about. I would like to demonstrate this concept by sharing a good example of quality infrastructure in Antigua and Barbuda in light of the unfortunate devastation caused by Hurricane Irma. In Antigua and Barbuda, Hurricane Irma severely destroyed 95% of buildings. However, in the midst of the devastation, there was a wharf and a slipway that survived, which played a significant role in evacuating residents and transporting food and supplies to the country in the hurricane's aftermath. This is largely due to the quality of the infrastructure financed by JICA back in 2011. Quality infrastructure therefore encompasses a concept that the infrastructure is stable, reliable, sustainable, long-lasting, inclusive, and has low maintenance costs. Overall, it should be a positive economic investment. My second point is about how we go about building resilience. As you are all aware, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction was agreed to in March 2015. In short, the framework made it clear that resilience cannot be separated from risk reduction, and both are necessary to ensure sustainable development. In many developing countries that face budget limitations, short-term economic gains are often prioritized over disaster risk reduction, and the amount that is allocated to it is disproportionately spent on emergency relief rather than on prevention and mitigation. This is the case even when we know disaster damage and destroy the very outcomes that were made by previous development investments. Since natural disasters frequently strike the same areas, lives are continuously lost and survivors are repeatedly deprived of economic growth opportunities, causing a vicious cycle of poverty. So how can we overcome these issues? Technologies and information access are indispensable to bring new perspectives and provide breakthroughs on issues that have been unresolved through conventional means. The government of Japan has partnered with GFDRR in the disaster risk reduction sector to prepare new knowledge tools that can be leveraged for innovative solutions and provide technical assistance to partner countries. JICA has also played a significant role in introducing Japan's experiences and knowledge to propel these endeavors, and we believe they can be tailored to fit the needs of countries that have been affected by disasters. Today, I hope that this discussion will build on our past experiences and generate new ideas to stop the vicious cycle of poverty by building resilient societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Look, Japan is a country not only that I think is one that has worked for decades on resilience and has achieved a level of expertise that is unique in the world, but one that has generously shared with countries around the world. But even then, I'm always amazed when I sit down and talk to Japanese officials of the continuous process of improvement. It's not that you become resilient with that. I was visiting some of the areas affected after the Great Tsunami, and actually they were saying that the proportion of children who died was much lower than the rest of the population, because they knew what to do. They exactly were ready, they had done the drills, they knew what the process was. So I think that it is a continuous process of exchange. They were very worried, for example, of people with disabilities who actually had died in a higher proportion, not because they didn't have universal access in the infrastructure, but because they needed the community preparedness to know who will be the person who will be taking good care of the people with disability and who will be the backup in case of a disaster. So continuous lessons of improvement, and I think that that's something that we take back from Japan. And now, somebody to inspire us, somebody to really bring a new level of energy, which is what we need for resilience in everything that we do. It's my great pleasure and honor on behalf of the World Bank Group to welcome Sir Richard Branson, head of the Virgin Group, to help us think through how do we raise the game on resilience. Thank you so much.
Dear friends, I'm incredibly grateful to be with you all today. And I'd like to thank, and this is quite a mouthful, the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery and the UN Office for Disaster Risk and Reduction for inviting me. Your mission, everybody's mission in this room is enormously important, but you would probably agree that it shouldn't take disasters of the scale we've just seen for people to appreciate the true value of your wonderful work. I've spent much of my time in the last few weeks dealing with the devastating impacts of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, and it had a devastating effect on the beautiful Caribbean, and trying to find ways in which we can rebuild all that's been lost and help the affected communities get back on their feet. As our Caribbean corner of the world is subjected to nature's fury, I can't help but ask how much more destruction is needed to show that the way we treat our planet is having serious consequences, and sadly will have even more serious consequences. Scientists have highlighted the link between carbon emissions and ocean surface temperatures. When Irma struck, the Atlantic and Caribbean waters had reached temperatures of 86 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees Celsius in some places. And I don't believe we need any further proof than that to know the time to act is now, both globally and locally. As some of you will know, I decided to ride out Hurricane Irma in my home in the British Virgin Islands. And to be perfectly honest, none of us, hunkering down in the basement we were on Necker Island, were prepared for its force and for its intensity. Irma unleashed the most ferocious winds I've ever seen in my life. I've been through three hurricanes before that. And it was truly heartbreaking to see the full extent of the devastation across the entire community once the storm had passed. Obviously Japan has seen the effects of a nuclear bomb, and you can never compare anything quite to that, but it really, to me, felt like that when I looked outside. In the BVI, I think every single island has been hit really hard and battered, and I think more than 80% of all residential buildings have become uninhabitable. All the local infrastructure, power, telecommunications, water, sanitation has either been destroyed or seriously damaged. While the last month or so has been devastating for everybody in the BVIs, I've been living in the Caribbean for a long time and know its amazing people well. Their resilience, their spirit are an incredible inspiration. The tasks ahead of them are daunting, but it's the people who give me hope that the Caribbean islands will bounce back stronger than ever. Let me be clear, from Puerto Rico to the BVI and Dominica, this is still very much a relief operation. Tens of thousands continue to be without shelter, power, and access to clean and safe drinking water. These urgent needs must be met, and they must be met quickly. This year's hurricane season is not yet over, and another storm could strike in the coming weeks. In parallel, we have to start thinking beyond emergency relief and turn our attention to the island's long-term recovery and reconstruction. Resilience is the theme of today's event, and resilience was the topic of many conversations I've had in the last few weeks. It really comes down to this question: as hurricanes will hit more often and with growing intensity, how can Caribbean islands avoid total destruction becoming the norm? Among other things, this means building homes able to withstand sustained and catastrophic hurricane-force winds over longer periods of time. It means installing distributed power grids that don't break down and that can be easily and can be repaired quickly. And it means restoring critical ecosystems like mangrove wetlands and even coral reefs that mitigate direct impacts of storms by naturally reducing wave heights and preventing soil erosion. And perhaps most importantly, it means weaning Caribbean islands off their costly dependency on fossil fuels. Running much of the region on diesel and other fuels comes with an enormous price tag. The Caribbean's cost of electricity generation is among the world's highest, and fuel expenditures consume up to 25% of GDP in most Caribbean nations. As an investor and as an entrepreneur, I've never seen a more compelling business case than the one presented by more energy efficient systems that make use of the abundance of the region's natural resources like solar and wind. Remember, you don't have to ship in sunshine on expensive boats. And while we're talking about resilience, I was heartened by the story of a Puerto Rican flower grower, Hector Santiago, whose solar panels sustained only minor damage during Hurricane Maria, and that allowed him to keep his plant nursery running, even as the rest of the island completely lost power. Well, that's the type of resilience I imagine would like to see go to scale. And by the way, solar panels saved us too on Necker Island. Unlike the rest of the unlike the rest of the BVI, just to illustrate a point, we had our electricity back in 24 hours, whereas Tortola, they're talking about potentially 9 months. So it was just wonderful seeing amongst all this devastation, the solar panels having survived. Aside from the vastly improving resilience through better systems, diversified energy supplies will also have a really positive economic effect. A few years ago, Jamaica quickly moved up 27 positions on the World Bank's Global Doing Business ranking, and I think that was quite largely as a result of reducing electricity costs through their clean energy movements. In sum, for the type of reconstruction we all envision, the Caribbean must seize the opportunity and take a leap from 20th century technology to 21st century innovation. This includes resisting the impulse to return to business as usual when it comes to reconstruction, simply because it is easier and cheaper in the short term. You can frame this as a formidable political and economic challenge, but I think we can be far more optimistic than that. With the political will and with the strong leadership emerging now across the region, and bolstered by strong support from the international community and businesses willing to invest, these island states have a great opportunity to build greener and more resilient communities than ever before, setting shining examples of what climate-smart recovery around the world can and should look like. Needless to say, an ounce spent on resilience now will be a pound saved in dealing with tomorrow's disasters. To find leadership in this space, you don't have to look much further than what has already been done in the Caribbean. A few years ago, Aruba announced an ambitious strategy to run entirely on renewables by 2020, and the island is already halfway there. And in Barbados, 1 in 2 households are now using solar water heaters, not only reducing electricity costs, but also creating jobs in a budding solar industry. And these are fantastic examples. What we need now is scale, and I suspect this hurricane might have just given us that opportunity. I have on various occasions called for a Marshall Plan for the Caribbean, a comprehensive strategy led by Caribbean governments to shape their own future and rebuild their nations. And from this meeting, I'm going to meet with the heads of Caribbean nations to try to put that in place. I think the consensus is that it's got to be a Marshall Plan for a greener, resilient Caribbean. The time now is to make this happen. And I just want to say thank you all for being here, for the incredibly important work that you all do to ensure that humankind is not left defenseless in the face of disasters like this. Thank you very much.
I think we have a clear call for action for a greener and more resilient reconstruction, a greener and more resilient Caribbean. And actually, this is just an example of what we see countries facing around the world when they're trying to define their reconstruction strategies. And this is precisely what we want to talk with one of the best panels that I have seen in many years in the World Bank, on a combination of perspectives and experience altogether. So we're going to have a transition video so that the panel members can come to the stage, and also to discuss a little bit of this question: can resilient infrastructure help save the world? Before we move to that, a quick reminder, your questions to #ResilienceDialogue. I'm going to be monitoring them through this process. We want to discuss what is the role of quality infrastructure in building as Branson said, a greener, more resilient world, how to take an in-depth look at how to scale up resilient infrastructure investment in vulnerable countries like the Caribbean, where the economic progress is 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, and where the levels of debt has grown tremendously because of the burden of reconstruction, and really how to look at the potential of innovative solutions both on the green infrastructure side and on the financing side, to really try to tackle reconstruction efforts in a way that is better than ever before. Resilience Dialogue, # all your questions, and let me invite the panel to join us while the video is played. Thank you.
Cities around the world are growing at unprecedented rates. Up to 1.4 million people per week are moving into urban areas. As much as 90% of this growth is happening in Africa and Asia, where tremendous investments in infrastructure are needed to support these expanding populations. In fact, more infrastructure will be built over the next 20 years than humanity has built in the last 2,000. This furious pace of development will either lock in risk or resilience for cities that are increasingly vulnerable to climate change and natural disasters. The trend so far is concerning. Impacts from disasters have risen sharply over the last few decades, and losses in the built environment alone will likely surpass $400 billion per year by 2030. This means more communities cut off from transportation networks, vital services, recovery efforts, and commerce, which could roll back decades of development gains. The built environment is the first line of defense against the impact of disasters. Resilient infrastructure saves lives and helps preserve livelihoods. Take the case of Japan. For decades, the government of Japan has proactively invested in quality infrastructure, leading the world in disaster risk management. A culture of risk prevention, developed through decades of government efforts, permeates the islands. Japan boasts the largest flood prevention infrastructure in the world, while its massive skyscrapers contain cutting-edge technology to reduce seismic risk. Development partners are working to scale up the quality infrastructure agenda within vulnerable countries, but demand for these projects is soaring. Recent estimates put global infrastructure needs at more than $5 trillion per year. Increasingly, experts are turning to nature to help. Called green infrastructure, nature-based solutions offer an effective, low-cost way to boost resilience while benefiting communities and protecting ecosystems. In some areas, however, like small island states, climate change and natural disasters pose an existential threat. A record-breaking hurricane season recently brought this reality crashing into the shores of the Caribbean, with dozens of lives lost. Can resilient infrastructure prevent disaster-based solutions work together to protect the world's growing urban populations? And how do we bring these projects to scale in vulnerable countries? Over the next hour, we'll explore these questions and more. Together, we can build a safer and more resilient future.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to GFDRR for setting the stage with this video. And now we get to a conversation. It's going to be a very open conversation, and I think that we have one of the best, as I was saying, one of the best panels that we had in a long, long time, the World Bank. Let me do quick introductions before we jump into the conversation. Aris Papadopoulos was the former CEO of Titan America, but somebody who has been obsessed over years about resilience. His book, Resilience, The Ultimate Sustainability, if you have And a great pleasure to have with us Kamal, Kishore, member of the National Disaster Management Authority of India, somebody who has worked on resilience at the local, at the regional, at the national level for decades, a great partner of the World Bank, somebody who the actions with him and his team have shown that it is possible to get resilient, and it is not only a 20-year perspective, you can be more resilient in a couple of years with practical actions, decisive community engagement, and the construction of more resilient infrastructure. So with that, let's